everyone, how are you doing? Enjoying staying at home? Lockdown, I hope. Um, we've all become bakers and chefs while we're stuck at home. I've been experimenting with some new recipes and trying my hands on baking. I love making breads. So today I'm making bagels, and I thought I would make a video and share with all of you if it comes out well. So let's get started. All right, we are making nice, chewy, crispy bagels today, or we are attempting. Let's see how it comes out. So here is everything that we need for making bagels, right? So essentially we need about this is going to give us about 8 to 9 bagels, right? Nice, good, large size bagels. So I've got sorry, 1 second. I've got some I'm just trying to gather a nice mixing spoon. Yeah, here. Okay, so I've got some I've got about 4 cups of flour, right? So ideally you should have bread flour to make this if you have access to bread flour. What I do to substitute bread flour is mix some white flour and wheat flour in whatever proportion you want. I change proportions depending on what I'm making. Today for bagels I've done half and half. 2 cups of maida or the white flour and 2 cups of whole wheat flour. And I've also done a little bit of cheating. I love a little taste of corn flour in my bagels, so I've added like just 1.5 teaspoon of corn flour in this. Yeah. So and what we need to do to sort of get the equivalent of bread flour is in about 4 cups of flour we add that much. I hope my camera is focusing. We add about half a teaspoon of baking powder and a 1/4 teaspoon of baking soda. You can add more, but I like to go easy on the baking sodas and baking powders because I feel that just gives an artificial touch, store-bought touch to our bagels. I like them thick and dense, but if you don't like that, you can add more baking powder and baking soda. Okay, so that's our flour, and on the side we will need so baking flour and baking powder and baking soda, and 4 cups of flour is what we have here. Then you would need about for 4 cups of flour you would need about 1.25 teaspoon of dry yeast. So that's my 1.25 teaspoon of dry yeast. I'm going to mix just about, it's too hot, about lukewarm water or a little more than lukewarm water to my yeast, right? So I'm just going to use some cold water to mix with that, and I just want to check temperature. Yeah, I think that's fine. So 1 cup and another half cup. So 1.5 cup of oops, it's hot. 1.5 cups of slightly warm water goes into your yeast. For the recipe we would also need, okay, we're done with the yeast. We would need a tablespoon of sugar. Now some people like to mix it in the flour, but I like to mix it in my water so that it kind of nicely dissolves. So I'm adding, actually what I'm doing is I'm adding 1 teaspoon of sugar, and I like adding a little bit of honey. You know, the honey gives your bagels a nice color, and it also helps it get chewier. You know, it helps the texture of the dough and the bagel and the outcome finally, right? So I'm adding about 3/4 teaspoon of honey, and I added a teaspoon of sugar. So so your yeast would need to dissolve in that water. So we would let it rest for about 3 to 4 minutes, or whatever time it takes for the yeast to nicely dissolve in it. And then I also need to add about a teaspoon of salt in this dough. So about a teaspoon of salt. You can measure it nicely. I'm very bad at my salt measurements. I have to keep tasting it. I actually taste these raw doughs as well when I make things, because I'm never sure. I think that's okay. So about a teaspoon of salt goes in there. Yeah, and now we need to nicely knead this dough with the water in which we added yeast and the sugar, and that should make our dough ready to make our bagels. So just waiting for. Okay, yeah, my yeast is all dissolved now. I'm just gonna be back in a second. Okay, sorry about that. So I'm gonna start mixing the water in my dough, and sometimes the water may be too much, so you want to go little by little and just see the consistency of the dough has to be sort of not very runny. It needs to be solid, nicely, like a thick. Some of the yeast is settled in at the bottom. I want to make sure that goes into my dough. Yeah, it needs to be a bit on the harder side, and not the kind of dough you would use for your regular breads, which are kind of loose doughs with a lot of water in it. So what I am doing is I'm just like getting the water to mix nicely in my dough for now, and then I would need to obviously use my hands. And if you have a bread maker, or if you have dough kneading machine, then obviously you're better off, you can always use it. But even if you use a dough kneading machine, you would have to eventually bring it out and use your hands on a clean surface to bring it together, and that also helps the texture of your bagels. Alright, so I'm just gonna bring this out. Now I need to use my hands, so I want to wipe the kitchen slab. Here we go. Okay, so I'm now going to use my hands first in this in the vessel where my dough is. You can use a glass vessel. I'm using a nice deep steel vessel. That's what I like, because then excuse me, it's not the dough is not coming out of it, and it's not keeps my kitchen clean while I'm cooking, and I like it that way. Okay, so I just use my hands first to make sure all the dough is nicely together. It's still very dry. So it will eventually consume all the water that I needed for my recipe. So there goes my rest of the yeast and warm water. And once it's all together, I'm going to bring it out on the kitchen slab and knead it nicely. The warmth of your hand also gives this dough a nice feel and texture. I mean, the texture that eventually your bread would get is helped by kneading with your hands. The kind of pressure, the even pressure that your dough gets when you're using hands is kind of important. So it's the kneading with hands is a step you cannot escape, you cannot skip while making bagels especially. Now I don't want to line my kitchen slab with the flour because that's going to change. The flour will get into my dough and it'll change the consistency. So I'm just gonna put a little bit of olive oil, and you need this olive oil. You would have to also nicely cover your dough with olive oil, or probably any oil for that matter. You can use a vegetable oil. So yeah, you need that to cover that when you let it sit to rise. Okay, now my dough looks nice, and here it comes. Here you see it. Yeah. So now I need to nicely knead it, and so this is basically what you need to do. I hope my camera is capturing this, but you need to nicely sort of, give it that motion. Rub it with your hands and just keep turning it around so that your dough is nicely and evenly sort of gets that pressure and gets that nice softness, which will give it a nice texture at the end. And see, I hope you can see it. It's not a very loose dough. It's a nice solid kind of a dough. So we need to do this for about 4 to 5 minutes. This whole pressing the dough and trying to get a nice consistency out of it. Trying to make it more sort of, hold together, become one in the process, and build some nice resilience. When you start this process, you would see that your dough would break easily, in pieces when you run your hands through it. But as you go along, it'll start sticking as if it's developing more starch in it, and that's what we need. We need it to start holding together. And I'm going to put some more oil. So this is something you can do. The oil will help your dough to get a nice rise when you let it sit. So you can keep putting olive oil, a good exercise. I'm going to skip my yoga today. I'm making this video in the morning hour, just got up, had my tea, and decided to get to this. So this is my exercise for the day, and I actually love doing it. It also, after this, I don't do anything which will make me wash my hands with soap for at least an hour or so. I feel that dough and the oil on my hands is almost like a nice manicure for my hands. So this dough is looking nice. I feel that I need just a little more water maybe. So just gonna add a teaspoon of water to it. And that's something that may happen as you go through this process of kneading the dough with your hands. you may feel that your dough is a little too hard or dry, and you can add tiny bit of water, but don't get very taken away or carried away with that, because when you let it sit to rise, it's going to become softer. It's going to feel more watery than what you feel right now. So I think my dough is very nice. It's feeling just right now. So I'm going to eventually fold it in from all sides like that. I don't know if you can see it. Fold it in, 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 and do that a few times. Just folding, 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 folding from all four sides, rubbing it a little, folding it, folding it, folding it, folding it, and get a nice ball like this. Okay, now what you want to do is put some oil in your pan or vessel, glass, steel, whatever you're using. Put the dough in there and just cover it nicely with oil, preferably olive oil, or but whatever oil you use. Just cover it nicely with the oil from all sides like that, and then we're gonna cover it. You can cover it with a kitchen towel, moist kitchen towel. I like to cover it with a proper cover, like a cover that would make it not exposed to air. And then you need to let it sit for about 1 to 2 hours to rise. It should almost double, or at least it should become 1.5 times. So it's not very hot in the city right now in Bangalore, so I prefer to just let my microwave run for 1.5 minutes or 2 minutes or whatever number of minutes gets it nicely warm, and leave it there for about 1 or 2 hours. I'm gonna actually leave it for 2 hours because I like my dough to nicely rise, and if it's slightly longer, it's not gonna harm your dough. It's gonna just make a nicer bread out of it. So we're gonna leave it in there for a couple of hours and then come back and see what else we need to do. What other ingredients you will need when we come back is a pan to boil the bagels with water. So you'll need a pan with water, and then you'll also need some egg wash to run your bagels, to cover your bagels with. Give it a nice egg wash, which gives it a nice shiny look when you bake it. You can also have with you sesame seeds, poppy seeds, or whatever you want to sprinkle, whatever seeds that you may want to sprinkle on your bagels. That's what you would need, and you would need some flour to dust. Okay, so I shall come back and talk to you in about 2 hours.